I never thought I'd watch my own daughter stand up in front of a room full of people and destroy her father's lies with nothing but his own words. But that's exactly what happened the day 12-year-old Sofia pulled out her phone and changed everything we thought we knew about truth, courage, and the lengths a parent will go to rewrite history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The community center was packed tighter than I'd ever seen. Every folding chair was occupied, people stood along the walls, and I could feel the weight of at least 60 pairs of eyes burning into the back of my neck. This wasn't supposed to be a trial, but it felt like one. The monthly parent meeting had turned into something else entirely when my ex-husband Marcus decided to make his accusations public. Sofia sat beside me, her small frame dwarfed by the adult-sized chair, her legs barely reaching the floor. She wore her favorite purple sweater, the one with tiny silver stars that caught the harsh fluorescent lighting. Her dark hair was pulled back in the ponytail I'd braided that morning, though a few strands had escaped and framed her face. She looked so young, too young to be sitting in a room where adults were discussing whether her mother was fit to raise her. Marcus stood at the makeshift podium near the front of the room, his voice carrying that practiced tone of wounded righteousness that I'd learned to recognize during our marriage. He wore his best suit, the navy one he saved for job interviews and court dates, and his hair was slicked back in a way that made him look more polished than he ever did at home. "I wouldn't normally air my personal business like this," Marcus said, his voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion to anyone who didn't know him the way I did. "But I have to speak up for my children. They need advocates, and if I don't stand up for them, who will?" The room was silent except for the hum of the overhead lights and the occasional squeak of someone shifting in their metal chair. I could see neighbors I'd known for years, other parents from Sofia's school, members of the PTA who had worked alongside me on fundraisers and bake sales. Their faces showed varying degrees of curiosity, concern, and what I feared most, discomfort directed at me. Mrs. Patterson, who had been Sofia's third-grade teacher and was now moderating this disaster of a meeting, cleared her throat nervously. She was a kind woman in her 50s, with grey hair and wire-rimmed glasses that she constantly adjusted when she was anxious. Right now, she was adjusting them every few seconds. "Marcus," she said gently, "perhaps we should discuss this in a more private setting. This is supposed to be a meeting about the school's fundraising goals for the spring semester." Marcus shook his head, his expression growing more pained. "No, Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern, but this affects everyone here. These people trusted Sarah with their children at school events, in carpools, at sleepovers. They deserve to know the truth about what kind of person she really is." My stomach dropped like I'd just stepped off a cliff. Around me, I could feel the energy in the room shift. People who had been politely listening were now leaning forward, their attention sharpening. This was no longer about fundraising or school policies. Marcus had just turned this into a public execution, and I was the one being led to the gallows. "The truth is," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word, "Sarah abandoned our children. Not physically, she's too smart for that, but emotionally, mentally, in every way that matters to a child's development. She walked away from her responsibilities as a mother the day she decided her own selfish desires were more important than our family. I felt like someone had reached inside my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. This wasn't just an attack on my character, it was a demolition of everything I'd built since our divorce. Every relationship I'd formed in this community, every bit of trust I'd earned as a single mother trying to do right by her children. Sofia's hand found mine under the table, Her fingers were small and warm, and they trembled slightly as they wrapped around mine. I squeezed back, trying to send her some reassurance I didn't feel. When I glanced down at her, her face was pale but determined. There was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before, a kind of steel that reminded me of my own mother when she was preparing to fight for something important. When Sarah left, Marcus continued, pacing now behind the podium like a lawyer addressing a jury. She took the children with her, yes, but she didn't take them to build a better life. She took them to spite me, to hurt me in the deepest way possible, and in doing so, she hurt them too. The lies flowed from his mouth like water, smooth and convincing and utterly false. But I could see people nodding, their faces reflecting sympathy for the wounded father standing before them. Marcus had always been good at this, at presenting himself as the victim while painting me as the villain. During our marriage, he convinced me that every problem we had was somehow my fault. Now he was doing the same thing to an entire room full of people. Sarah tells people she left because of our marriage problems, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone that made it seem like he was confiding in close friends, rather than addressing a room full of near strangers. But that's not the whole truth. She left because she couldn't handle being a mother. The responsibility was too much for her. She wanted her freedom more than she wanted her children's well-being. I wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to tell them about the nights I'd spent walking the floors with a colicky baby while Marcus slept peacefully in the next room. I wanted to describe the years I'd spent being the only parent who showed up to school plays and soccer games and parent-teacher conferences while he worked late or went out with friends. I wanted to explain how I'd sacrificed my own career, my own dreams, my own identity to be the kind of mother I thought our children deserved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, but I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing up, and every eye in the room was on Marcus, hanging on his every word. He had their attention, their sympathy, their trust. What could I possibly say that would compete with the narrative he was spinning? The children live with her now because our legal system favors mothers, Marcus continued, his tone growing more bitter. But living with someone and being cared for by them are two very different things. Sofia and her brother Diego have been raising themselves for the past 2 years. Sarah provides a roof over their heads and food on the table, but emotionally, she checked out long ago. Diego, my 10-year-old son wasn't here tonight, thank God. He was at home with my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, probably doing homework at the kitchen table and completely unaware that his father was publicly destroying my reputation 20 minutes away. Diego was sensitive, more so than Sofia, and hearing these lies would have crushed him. But Sofia was here, and she was hearing every word. I could feel the tension radiating from her small body, see the way her jaw was clenched, and her free hand was balled into a fist on her lap. She was angry, not at me, but at what was happening to me. That realization brought tears to my eyes that I quickly blinked away. I couldn't cry here, not in front of these people, not when Marcus was painting. Me as weak and selfish. I know this is hard to hear, Marcus said, his voice softening as if he were delivering news of a terminal diagnosis. I know many of you have known Sarah for years, and she can be very charming when she wants to be, but charm isn't the same as character. And as much as it pains me to say this about the mother of my children, Sarah's actions over the past 2 years have shown her true character. Mrs. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in her seat near the front of the room. A few other people exchanged glances, and I could see the doubt creeping into their faces. These were people who had seen me volunteer at school events, who had watched me cheer from the sidelines at Sofia's basketball games, who had shared coffee with me after dropping our kids off at school. But Marcus was presenting them with a different version of me, and human nature made them want to believe there might be some truth to it. The children are struggling, Marcus continued, and this was the part that made my heart break completely. Sofia's grades have dropped. Diego has started having nightmares. They're withdrawn, anxious, and when they come to visit me, all they want to talk about is how much they miss having a real family. They miss having a mother who cares about them more than she cares about herself. That was when Sofia stood up. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. She didn't leap to her feet or make any noise. She simply stood, her chair scraping quietly against the linoleum floor, and every head in the room turned to look at her. She was so small standing there among all those adults. But there was something about her posture that commanded attention. Her shoulders were back, her chin was raised, and her dark eyes were fixed on her father with an intensity that made several people shift uncomfortably. "Sofia," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "sweetheart, maybe you should sit down. This is grown-up conversation." But Sofia didn't sit down. Instead, she reached into the small purse she'd been carrying, the one I'd given her for her birthday last month, because she'd wanted to feel more grown-up. Her fingers were steady as she pulled out her phone, a simple smartphone I'd bought her for emergencies and staying in touch when she was at her father's house. "I have something to show everyone," Sofia said, her voice clear and strong despite her small size. "Something that will prove my dad is lying." The room went dead silent. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to stare at his daughter, his confident expression faltering for the first time since he'd started speaking. I could see a flash of something almost like fear cross his face before he composed himself again. "Sofia, honey," Marcus said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "You're confused. Adults are trying to have an important conversation here. Why don't you go sit with your mother and let us finish?" But Sofia didn't move. She held her phone up so everyone could see it, her small fingers gripping it tightly. "No, Dad, I'm not confused, and I'm not going to let you keep lying about Mom." The words hung in the air like smoke, and I could feel the energy in the room shift again. People were leaning forward now, their attention completely focused on my 12-year-old daughter, who was standing up to a room full of adults with nothing but a phone and the truth. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat nervously. "Sofia, what exactly do you want to show us?" Sofia's eyes never left her father's face as she answered. "Text messages, from him to me and Diego. Messages that show everyone who he really is and what he really thinks about us." Marcus took a step forward, his composure cracking completely now. "Sofia, you don't understand what you're doing. Those messages were private, between family members. You can't just—" "Private?" Sofia interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Like this meeting was supposed to be private before you decided to lie about Mom in front of everyone? Like our family problems were supposed to be private before you made them public to hurt her?" I had never been more proud of my daughter than I was in that moment. She was 12 years old, standing in a room full of adults who had been perfectly willing to believe the worst about her mother, and she was fighting back with nothing but her own courage and the truth. My chest swelled with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, because no child should have to defend their parent the way Sofia was defending me. "I think," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "that perhaps we should take a break and discuss this situation privately with the family members involved." But Sofia shook her head firmly. "No, Mrs. Patterson, my dad wanted to make this public. He wanted everyone here to hear his lies about my mom. So now they're going to hear the truth about him." She looked around the room, making eye contact with people I'd known for years, people who had just spent 20 minutes listening to Marcus tear apart my character and my reputation as a mother. When she spoke again, her voice was steady and clear. "My mom didn't abandon us. She saved us, and I can prove it." The silence that followed Sofia's declaration stretched like a held breath. I watched my daughter standing there, phone in hand, and suddenly I was transported back to the beginning of everything that had led us to this moment. Back to when I thought Marcus Rodriguez was the answer to all my dreams, and I had no idea he would become my worst nightmare. I met Marcus when I was 24, working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm in downtown Phoenix. I'd just moved to Arizona from my hometown of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, carrying nothing but an art degree, a beat-up Honda Civic, and enough determination to power a small city. My apartment was a studio above a bakery that smelled like cinnamon rolls. Every morning at 5 a.m., and I thought I was living the dream. Marcus was a client. His construction company needed a new logo and marketing materials, and he walked into our office on a Tuesday afternoon wearing work boots that had seen actual work and a smile that could have powered the entire downtown district. He was handsome in a rugged way that made my Midwestern heart skip beats, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges and hands that looked like they could build houses and hold hearts with equal skill. He was charming in a way that felt genuine, not practiced. He brought coffee for everyone in the office, remembered my colleague Jennifer's name after meeting her once, and when he looked at my preliminary designs, he said, "You see things differently than other people. That's a gift." I fell for him like a rock thrown from a cliff. Our courtship was a whirlwind of late-night dinners at hole-in-the-wall Mexican restaurants where he knew the owners by name, weekend trips to Sedona where he'd point out rock formations, and tell me stories about climbing them as a teenager, and long conversations about building something meaningful together. He talked about expanding his business, about creating something that would last, about finding someone who could be his partner in all of it. I should have paid more attention to the way he talked about his ex-girlfriend Lisa. He dated her for 3 years before me, and when he mentioned her, which was more often than felt comfortable, there was always an edge to his voice. She was too needy. She couldn't handle his success. She didn't understand what it meant to support a man's dreams. At the time, I thought he was just being honest about a failed relationship. Now I recognize it as the first red flag I ignored. We married 18 months after we met, in a small ceremony at a resort in Scottsdale that felt like something out of a magazine. I wore my grandmother's pearls and a dress I'd found on sale, but felt like a princess in. Marcus cried when I walked down the aisle, and when he said his vows about promising to love and protect me, I believed every word. The first year of marriage was good. Marcus's business was growing, and I was freelancing from home, building my own client base while supporting his dreams. We bought a house in a neighborhood where children rode bikes in the streets and neighbors borrowed cups of sugar from each other. I planted a garden in the backyard and dreamed about the children we'd have someday playing among the tomatoes and sunflowers. I got pregnant with Sofia when I'd been married for 2 years. Marcus was over the moon, calling everyone he knew to share the news, buying pregnancy books, before I even made it to my first doctor's appointment. He painted the nursery himself, a soft, lavender color that would work for either a boy or girl, and hung glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling because he wanted our baby to grow up reaching for the sky. But pregnancy changed something in Marcus, or maybe it just revealed something that had always been there. He became protective in ways that felt suffocating. He didn't want me lifting anything heavier than a coffee cup. He didn't want me driving alone after dark. He started questioning my doctor's advice and insisting on coming to every appointment, not as a supportive partner, but as someone who didn't trust me to handle things correctly. When Sofia was born, tiny and perfect with a shock of dark hair and lungs that could wake the neighbors, I thought everything would settle back to normal. Instead, it got worse. Marcus had opinions about everything. How often I should feed her, when she should sleep, whether I was holding her too much or not enough. He bought parenting books and quoted them like scripture, as if the 7 years he'd spent working construction had somehow made him an expert on child development. The criticism started small. I was being too anxious, or not anxious enough. I was spoiling Sofia by responding to her cries immediately, or I was being neglectful by letting her cry for more than 30 seconds. Nothing I did was right, and Marcus always had a better way, a smarter approach, a more effective solution. By the time Sofia was 6 months old, I felt like a failure as a mother and a wife. Marcus would come home from work and immediately take over with the baby, sighing heavily as if I'd been doing everything wrong all day. He'd make comments about how exhausted I looked, how the house wasn't as clean as it used to be, how I seemed to have lost my motivation for everything except the baby. When Sofia was 18 months old, I got pregnant again. This time, Marcus's reaction was different. He was happy, but in a controlled way that felt more like satisfaction than joy. He talked about having his boy, and how Diego would carry on the Rodriguez name. The pressure to have a son felt enormous, and when the ultrasound confirmed we were having a boy, Marcus acted like I'd finally done something right. Diego's birth was harder than Sofia's. The labor was longer, the recovery more difficult, and I struggled with what I now know was postpartum depression. But Marcus didn't believe in therapy or medication or any kind of outside help. He believed in pushing through, in being stronger than your problems, in not airing your dirty laundry. To strangers who didn't understand your family, instead of getting help, I got more criticism. I was too emotional, too tired, too focused on the negative. Marcus started making decisions without consulting me, telling me what was best for the children, for the house, for our marriage. When I tried to express my feelings or concerns, he'd listen with a patient expression and then explain why I was wrong, why my perspective was skewed by hormones or exhaustion or my tendency to overthink everything. The control started slowly, like water seeping through a crack in a foundation. First, it was managing our finances because I was too scattered to handle money properly. Then it was making decisions about the children's schedules because I was too inconsistent to create proper routines. Eventually it extended to everything: what I wore, where I went, who I talked to, how I spent my time. Marcus had a way of making his control seem like care. He handled the money because he loved me too much to let me stress about bills. He made decisions about social events because he knew I got overwhelmed in large groups. He chose our family activities because he wanted to make sure we were building strong memories together. But underneath the caring facade was something darker. If I questioned his decisions, I was being ungrateful. If I wanted to do something on my own, I was being selfish. If I expressed any dissatisfaction with our life, I was being negative and harmful to the children's emotional development. The isolation happened gradually. Marcus didn't forbid me from seeing friends or family, but he made it difficult in subtle ways. He'd schedule family activities during times when I'd planned to see friends. He'd create crises that required my immediate attention when I was supposed to go out. He'd make comments about how certain people were bad influences or didn't really understand our family situation. My friend Jessica from college visited when Sofia was 3 and Diego was almost 2. She stayed for a weekend, and I was so excited to show off my children and our beautiful house and what I thought was my perfect life. But Marcus was strange the entire time she was there. He was polite but cold, helpful but dismissive. After she left, he spent an hour explaining all the ways she'd been inappropriate, judgmental, and clearly jealous of what we'd built together. She doesn't understand what real commitment looks like, Marcus said as we cleaned up after dinner. She's still jumping from job to job, relationship to relationship. She can't handle seeing someone who's actually built something stable. I defended Jessica, but weakly. Marcus had a way of planting seeds of doubt that grew in the fertile soil of my own insecurities. Maybe Jessica had seemed a little critical of our routine. Maybe she had made comments about how much Marcus was involved in daily decisions. Maybe I was being too sensitive to his observations. By the time Sofia started kindergarten, I barely recognized myself. I'd gained weight and lost confidence. I second-guessed every decision I made and looked to Marcus for approval before doing anything. I'd given up freelancing because he convinced me that children needed me home full-time, but I felt trapped and purposeless. The worst part was how good Marcus was at being two different people. In public, he was the devoted husband and father, the man who coached Diego's little league team and volunteered for Sofia's school fundraisers. He was charming and helpful and always ready with a funny story or a compliment for other parents. People loved him, and by extension, they thought we had the perfect marriage. But at home, behind closed doors, he was different, critical, controlling, always disappointed in something I'd done or failed to do. He never yelled or got physically violent, which somehow made it worse because I couldn't point to any specific thing he was doing wrong. He was just slowly erasing me, replacing my thoughts with his thoughts, my dreams with his plans, my voice with his echo. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when Sofia was 7 and Diego was 5. I'd spent the day cleaning the house from top to bottom because Marcus's mother was coming for dinner. I'd cooked his favorite meal, gotten the children dressed in their nicest clothes, and set the table with the good china we only used for special occasions. Marcus came home from work in a foul mood. A client had complained about a project, and he'd had to redo work that should have been finished weeks earlier. He walked through the house with the systematic precision of a health inspector, finding a fault with everything I'd done. The living room wasn't vacuumed properly. The children's bathroom still had water spots on the mirror. The dinner smelled overcooked. When his mother arrived, Marcus transformed back into the charming son and devoted husband. He complimented the meal I'd prepared, bragged about how hard I worked to keep the house perfect, and played with the children like he was Father of the Year. His mother left, thinking I was lucky to have such a wonderful husband, and I went to bed feeling like I was losing my mind. That night, lying in bed next to Marcus as he slept peacefully, I had a moment of crystal clarity. I realized that I was teaching my children that this was what love looked like. Sofia was already walking on eggshells around her father, trying to anticipate his moods and avoid his criticism. Diego was becoming withdrawn and anxious, flinching when adults raised their voices even slightly. I was raising my daughter to believe that women should shrink themselves to make men comfortable. I was raising my son to believe that love meant control and criticism disguised as care. The thought terrified me more than anything Marcus had ever said or done. The next morning, while Marcus was at work and the children were at school, I called my sister Elena in Iowa. I hadn't talked to her in months because Marcus always had something negative to say about my family. Some reason. Why they didn't understand our situation or were trying to interfere in our marriage. "Sarah," Elena said when she heard my voice. "Oh my God, I've been so worried about you. I've called and texted, but you never respond." I started crying before I could say anything else. All the tears I'd been holding back for years came pouring out, and Elena just listened while I sobbed into the phone like a broken child. "I need help," I finally managed to say. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know how to be a person without asking permission first." Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was fierce with protective love. "Come home," she said. "Pack the kids and come home. Today." "I can't," I said automatically. "Marcus would never allow—" "Marcus doesn't get to allow or not allow anything," Elena interrupted. "You're not his property, Sarah. You're his wife, and wives get to make their own decisions about their own lives." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I made a decision without consulting Marcus first. I called a lawyer. Sofia held her phone steady as the room waited in breathless anticipation. Mrs. Patterson had given up trying to restore order to the meeting, and even Marcus had fallen silent, his face pale as he stared at his daughter with something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Mom," Sofia said, turning to me with eyes that held more strength than any 12-year-old should need to possess, "should I start with the messages from last week, or the ones from when you first left Dad?" The question hit me like a physical blow. My daughter had been carrying these messages, this evidence of her father's true character, for months, maybe years. She'd been protecting me and Diego in the only way she knew how, by documenting the truth when she realized that adults might not believe her word alone. "Sofia," I whispered, reaching for her hand. "You don't have to do this. We can handle this privately." But Sofia shook her head with a determination that reminded me so much of my own mother that it took my breath away. "No, Mom. Dad made this public. He wanted everyone here to think you're a bad mother. Now they need to know who the bad parent really is." Marcus took a step forward, his courtroom confidence completely shattered. "Sofia, sweetheart, you're misunderstanding those messages. Sometimes adults say things when they're frustrated that they don't really mean. You're taking everything out of context." "Out of context?" Sofia's voice rose, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she sounded like the child she was supposed to be. Hurt, confused and angry that the adult she was supposed to trust had betrayed that trust so completely. "Dad, you told me and Diego that Mom was a selfish woman who cared more about herself than her own children. You said she was probably going to abandon us completely once she found a new boyfriend to replace you with." The gasp that went through the room was audible. I saw Mrs. Patterson's hand fly to her mouth, saw other parents exchange shocked glances. These weren't the words of a frustrated father going through a difficult divorce. These were the words of a man deliberately poisoning his children against their mother. "That's not what I said," Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're remembering it wrong. I was trying to prepare you for the possibility that your mother might—" "I'm not remembering it wrong," Sofia interrupted, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I have it right here. Do you want me to read your exact words, Dad? Because I saved them all." She looked around the room, making eye contact with parents who had children the same age as her and Diego. "My dad has been sending me and my brother messages for 2 years, telling us that our mom doesn't really love us. He tells us that we're a burden to her and that she only kept us to hurt him. He says she's going to get tired of taking care of us and send us away." The room was dead silent now. I could see the horror on people's faces as they began to understand what Sofia was describing. This wasn't a custody dispute between two adults who couldn't get along. This was a systematic campaign of emotional abuse directed at children by their own father. "But that's not the worst part," Sofia continued, and I felt my heart stop. There was more. How much had my children been carrying without telling me? How much pain had they been absorbing to protect me from knowing how cruel their father really was? Sofia looked directly at Marcus, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "The worst part is what you said about Diego. My 10-year-old son. My gentle, sensitive boy who loved animals and comic books and still slept with the stuffed elephant I'd given him when he was 3. What could Marcus have possibly said about Diego that was worse than poisoning them against me? You told me that Diego was weak like Mom," Sofia said, reading directly from her phone now. "You said real men don't cry when their parents fight, and that you were ashamed to have a son who was so emotional. You said if I didn't toughen him up, he'd grow up to be a disappointment just like her." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was consuming everything good and decent in the room. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Marcus had not only been systematically destroying my relationship with my children, he'd been teaching Sofia, that she was responsible for her younger brother's emotional well-being. He'd turned my 12-year-old daughter into a parent figure while simultaneously convincing her that the actual parent who loved and supported them was the enemy. Mrs. Patterson stood up slowly, her face white with shock. "Marcus," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger, "please tell me this child is mistaken about what you said to her." But Marcus couldn't speak. He opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. His carefully constructed facade had been demolished by his own daughter's courage, and there was no lie smooth enough to rebuild it. "He's not denying it," Sofia observed with the devastating clarity that children sometimes possess. "He can't deny it because I have proof." She held up her phone again, and this time she pressed play on what I assumed was a voice message. Marcus's voice filled the room, tinny through the small speaker, but unmistakably his. "Sofia, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your mother is not the person you think she is. She's selfish and manipulative, and she's only keeping you and Diego to hurt me. Real mothers put their children first, but your mother puts herself first every single time. I know this is hard to hear, but you're old enough to understand the truth." The recording continued, but I could barely process the words through the roaring in my ears. He was systematically poisoning my children's minds, convincing them that every sacrifice I'd made for them was actually selfishness. Every moment of love I'd shown them was manipulation. But then Sofia did something that made my heart soar even as it broke. She stopped the recording and looked around the room with the composure of someone far older than her 12 years. "My dad is wrong about my mum," she said simply. "And I know he's wrong because I live with her every day. I see how hard she works to take care of us. I see how she stays up late helping Diego with his homework when he's struggling. I see how she cries sometimes when she thinks we're not looking, not because she's sorry she left Dad, but because she's worried about whether she's doing a good enough job raising us alone." The room was so quiet, I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Sofia's words were hitting their target with surgical precision, dismantling every lie Marcus had told about me with the simple truth of a child's observations. "My mom didn't abandon us," Sofia continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She saved us. Before she left Dad, our house was scary. Dad yelled all the time. He made Mom cry. He told Diego he was too sensitive and made him feel bad for having feelings. He made me feel like I had to be perfect all the time, or I was disappointing the whole family." She looked directly at her father, and I saw no hatred in her eyes, which somehow made her words even more powerful. "When Mom took us away from that house, I could finally breathe again. Diego stopped having nightmares. Mom started smiling again. We became a family instead of people walking on eggshells all the time." Marcus found his voice finally, but it came out as a croak. "Sofia, you don't understand. Marriage is complicated. Your mother left me, not the other way around. I was trying to keep our family together." "No, Dad," Sofia said with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a small child. "You were trying to keep Mom trapped. There's a difference." She turned to address the room again. This small girl taking on a room full of adults who had been perfectly willing to believe the worst about her mother, based on the lies of a man who had been emotionally abusing his own children. "My dad told you that Mom abandoned us emotionally, but that's not true. Mom is the one who comes to all my basketball games. Mom is the one who helps Diego with his science projects. Mom is the one who makes pancakes on Saturday mornings and lets us help even though we make a huge mess. Mom is the one who reads to us every night and tells us we can be anything we want to be." Sofia's voice grew more passionate as she continued, and I realized she wasn't just defending me. She was teaching these adults about what real love looked like, about what a healthy parent-child relationship actually was. When I'm scared about something at school, I don't worry about telling Mom because I know she'll help me figure it out. When Diego has a bad day, He comes home and tells Mom about it because he knows she'll listen and make him feel better. When we're happy about something, Mom is the first person we want to share it with because we know she'll be excited for us. She paused, looking around the room at faces that were now filled with shame and regret. These people had been ready to condemn me based on the word of a man they barely knew, and now they were seeing the truth through the eyes of a child who had lived it. "But when Dad sends us messages," Sofia continued, "they're always about how bad Mom is, or how hard his life is without us, or how we need to choose sides in a fight we never wanted to be part of. He doesn't ask about our grades or our friends or what we did at school. He just wants to make sure we still blame Mom for everything that went wrong." The truth was devastating in its simplicity. Marcus had never adapted to being a divorced father who needed to build a relationship with his children separate from his anger toward their mother. Instead, he'd turned them into weapons in his ongoing war against me, and Sofia was calling him out on it with the fearless honesty that only children possess. "I saved all his messages," Sofia said, "because I knew someday an adult would ask us who was telling the truth, and I wanted to have proof that Mom never said bad things about Dad, but Dad says bad things about Mom all the time." She looked at Mrs. Patterson, who was still standing with her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Patterson, you taught us in school that bullying is wrong whether it happens in person or through messages. Well, my dad has been bullying my mum through me and Diego for 2 years, and today he tried to bully her in front of all of you, but I'm not going to let him do it anymore." The transformation in the room was palpable. Parents who had been listening to Marcus with sympathy were now looking at him with disgust. People who had been avoiding eye contact with me were now staring at Marcus with expressions of horror and disbelief. But Sofia wasn't finished. She held up her phone one more time, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast, but had somehow emerged stronger rather than broken. "I have 47 messages from my dad over the past 6 months. 23 of them say something bad about Mom. 15 of them tried to convince me and Diego that we'd be happier living with him. 9 of them tell us that Mom is going to abandon us, or get tired of us, or find someone more important than us." She paused, letting the numbers sink in. "I have 0 messages from Mom saying anything bad about Dad. 0 messages trying to convince us that he doesn't love us. 0 messages trying to make us choose between them." The mathematical precision of her evidence was devastating. Sofia had been conducting an investigation for months, documenting the systematic emotional abuse she and her brother were experiencing, preparing for exactly this moment when she would need to defend her mother and herself against lies told by someone who was supposed to protect them. "My dad said Mom abandoned us," Sofia concluded, "but the only person who abandoned anyone is Dad. He abandoned being a good father the day he decided that hurting Mom was more important than loving us." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. This wasn't anticipation or curiosity. This was the silence of people who had witnessed something profound and life-changing, who had seen a child display more courage and wisdom than most adults manage in a lifetime. Marcus stood frozen at the front of the room, his carefully constructed lies in ruins around his feet. There was nothing left for him to say, no way to recover from the devastation that his own daughter had delivered with nothing but the truth and the evidence to support it. And in that moment, I understood that Sofia hadn't just defended me. She had taught everyone in that room about resilience, about courage, about the power of standing up for what's right, even when you're the smallest person in the room. She had shown them that children are not just victims of adult dysfunction, but that they can be heroes who save their families with nothing but honesty and love. The silence that followed Sofia's final words stretched like the moment between lightning and thunder. Marcus stood at the front of the room, his face drained of all color, looking like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse in real time. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the truth his own daughter had delivered with devastating precision. Mrs. Patterson was the first to break the silence. She walked slowly toward Sofia, her eyes bright with tears, and knelt down so she was at eye level with my brave daughter. "Sofia," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "what you just did took incredible courage. I want you to know that every adult in this room heard you, and we believe you." She stood and turned to face Marcus, her expression transforming from gentle compassion to barely controlled fury. "Marcus Rodriguez, I have been teaching children for 32 years, and I have never been more disgusted by an adult's behavior than I am right now. You came into this meeting with the intention of destroying a woman's reputation, and instead you've shown us exactly who you really are." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Mrs. Patterson held up her hand, her teacher's authority stopping him mid-breath. "You have been emotionally abusing your children for 2 years, using them as weapons against their mother, and then you had the audacity to come here and accuse her of abandonment? You should be ashamed of yourself, but frankly, I don't think you're capable of that level of self-reflection." Other parents began to stand. Janet Morrison, whose daughter was in Sofia's class, stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "Sarah," she said, her voice shaking, "I owe you an apology. I've been listening to whispers and rumors about your divorce, and I'm ashamed to say that some of them came from Marcus. I believed him when he painted you as an unstable mother who was keeping his children from him out of spite. I should have known better. I should have trusted what I could see with my own eyes, instead of listening to gossip." Tom Chen, my neighbor whose wife watched Diego after school, shook his head in disgust. "Marcus, I've seen Sarah with those kids every single day for 2 years. I've watched her walk them to school in the rain, cheer at every soccer game, stay up all night when they're sick. The idea that she abandoned them is not just wrong, it's offensive to anyone with functioning eyes." One by one, other parents began to speak up. People who had known me, who had worked with me on school committees, who had seen me parenting my children in real time, began to voice their support and their outrage at what Marcus had tried to do. But it was Patricia Gonzalez, whose son had been bullied at school last year, who said the words that hit hardest. "What you did to those children," she said, pointing at Marcus with a finger that shook with anger, "is exactly what we teach our kids is unacceptable behavior. You used your position as their father to manipulate them, to make them question their own perceptions, to turn them against someone who loves them. If any child in this school did what you've been doing, they'd be suspended immediately. The fact that you're an adult makes it worse, not better." Marcus looked around the room desperately, searching for a single sympathetic face and finding none. His carefully constructed public image was crumbling in real time, and there was no way to rebuild it. Too many people had heard too much truth. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "Sarah turned the children against me. She poisoned them with lies about our marriage. I was just trying to defend myself." But Sofia, my amazing daughter, who had already shown more maturity than her father ever would, stepped forward one more time. "Dad," she said, and there was pity in her voice now, which somehow made her words even more devastating. "Mom never told us anything bad about you. We figured it out ourselves by watching how you treated her and how you treated us. Children aren't stupid. We know the difference between love and control." She paused, looking at him with eyes that held more wisdom than any 12-year-old should possess. "You keep saying Mom turned us against you, but the truth is, you turned us against you. Every mean message you sent. Every time you made us feel guilty for loving Mom. Every time you told us we were wrong for feeling safe and happy in our new home. You did that to yourself." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement and support. Sofia had just articulated something that many adults struggle to understand, that children are not passive victims of their circumstances, but active observers who form their own conclusions based on how they're treated. Marcus's lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, stood up and began walking toward the exit. Even he had apparently heard enough to know that this was no longer a battle worth fighting. Mrs. Patterson called for order, but her tone was gentle now, supportive rather than authoritative. "I think this meeting has served its purpose," she said, "though not in the way anyone expected. Sarah, I want to personally apologize for allowing this situation to unfold in a public forum. This should have been handled differently." I stood up slowly, my legs shaky from the adrenaline and emotion of the past hour. "Mrs. Patterson, you have nothing to apologize for. Sometimes the truth needs witnesses." I looked around the room at faces that had transformed from curious and judgmental to supportive and protective. These people had just witnessed something extraordinary, a child standing up for justice, not with anger or hatred, but with truth and evidence and an unshakable moral compass. "I want to thank all of you," I continued, "for listening to Sofia with open hearts. She taught me something tonight about courage that I'll never forget." I turned to my daughter, this incredible human being who had saved our family with nothing but honesty and love, and knelt down to pull her into my arms. "I am so proud of you," I whispered into her hair. "You were braver tonight than I have ever been in my entire life." Sofia hugged me back fiercely, and I felt 2 years of fear and anxiety melt away in that embrace. We were going to be okay. Not just okay, but stronger than we'd ever been before. As people began to file out of the community center, many stopped to speak with us. Apologies, offers of support, invitations for play dates and coffee. The community that Marcus had tried to turn against me was instead rallying around us, and I realized that truth really does have a power that lies can never match. Marcus left without saying another word to any of us. He simply walked out the door and disappeared into the parking lot, his public humiliation complete. I felt a moment of pity for him, but it was quickly overshadowed by relief. After 2 years of living in fear of his manipulation and lies, I was finally free. The drive home was quiet but peaceful. Sofia sat in the front seat, her phone in her lap, looking out the window at the familiar streets of our neighborhood. The neighborhood where she felt safe, where she could be herself, where she didn't have to walk on eggshells or manage an adult's emotions. "Mum," she said as we pulled into our driveway, "I have a question." "What's that, sweetheart?" "Do you think Dad will ever understand why what he did was wrong?" It was such a mature question, so full of hope and sadness and wisdom that it took my breath away. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that some adults never learn to take responsibility for their actions? "I don't know, baby," I said honestly. "But that's not your job to worry about. Your job is to be a kid and let me worry about the grown-up stuff." Sofia smiled, the first genuinely carefree smile I'd seen from her in months. "Good, because I'm really tired of being worried all the time." Inside the house, Diego was waiting for us, curled up on the couch with Mrs. Chen reading him a story. When he saw us come in, he jumped up and ran to Sofia. "How did it go?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. "Did you have to use the phone?" Sofia nodded solemnly. "I used the phone, little brother, and it worked." Diego's face broke into a grin. "So we don't have to worry anymore?" "No more worrying," Sofia confirmed, pulling him into a hug. "We're safe now." Later that night, after Diego had gone to bed and I'd tucked Sofia in with extra hugs and reassurances, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea and thought about everything that had happened. My daughter had taught me something profound about the nature of courage. I'd always thought courage meant not being afraid, but Sofia had shown me that real courage means being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. She'd been terrified to stand up to her father in front of all those people, but she'd done it because she knew it was necessary. She'd also taught me about the power of preparation. For months, she'd been quietly documenting the emotional abuse she and Diego were experiencing, not because anyone told her to, but because her own sense of justice told her that someday someone would need to see the evidence. She'd been building a case for truth, one screenshot at a time, but most importantly, she'd taught me about resilience. She hadn't let her father's manipulation turn her bitter or broken. Instead, she'd used it to develop her own moral compass, her own sense of right and wrong, her own determination to protect the people she loved. 3 months later, I received a letter from Marcus's lawyer informing me that he was dropping his custody suit and would no longer be seeking visitation rights. Apparently, word of what had happened at the community center had spread through his social and professional circles, and he'd decided that a strategic retreat was his best option. Sofia's response when I told her the news was typically wise. Good. Maybe now he can work on being a better person instead of trying to make everyone else look worse. 6 months after that night, Sofia was invited to speak at a workshop for children of divorce. She talked about the importance of documenting truth, of speaking up for yourself and your siblings, and of understanding that adult problems are not children's fault or responsibility. But the thing she said that made me proudest was this: sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you don't do their job right. When that happens, you have to protect yourself and the people you love. It's scary, but you're braver than you think you are. A year later, Diego's nightmares had stopped completely. His grades improved, he made new friends, and he started playing piano because he wanted to, not because anyone expected him to. Sofia had started a peer counseling group at school for kids dealing with difficult family situations. As for me, I went back to school to become a family therapist. I wanted to help other parents and children navigate the aftermath of toxic relationships, to teach them that healing is possible and that the truth really can set you free. The community that had witnessed Sofia's courage that night became our extended family. Mrs. Patterson became like a grandmother to both children. Janet Morrison and I became close friends, bonded by the shared experience of learning not to trust gossip over evidence. Tom and his wife became our surrogate aunts and uncles, always ready with practical help and emotional support. But the most important thing that came out of that terrible, wonderful night was the knowledge that my children and I were stronger than we'd ever imagined. We'd faced the worst kind of emotional manipulation and abuse, and we'd not only survived, but thrived. Sofia taught everyone in that room that children are not helpless victims of adult dysfunction. They are capable of remarkable courage, incredible wisdom, and profound love. They can be heroes in their own stories, defenders of truth, protectors of justice, and sometimes, just sometimes, they can save their entire family with nothing but a phone full of evidence and the courage to stand up and say, "This is wrong, and I'm not going to let it continue." If you're watching this and you're in a situation where someone is trying to rewrite your story, trying to make you doubt your own experiences, trying to turn people against you with lies and manipulation, remember Sofia's example. Document the truth. Trust your own perceptions. And when the time comes to defend yourself and the people you love, have the courage to stand up and speak. The truth is a powerful thing. It doesn't always win immediately, but it always wins eventually. And sometimes it takes the voice of a child to remind adults what truth sounds like. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And no one has the right to rewrite your truth to make themselves look better. Be brave, be honest, and never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right, even when you're the smallest person in the room. 2 years after that transformative Night at the community center, I found myself standing in front of a different kind of audience. This time, it wasn't a room full of neighbors who had been fed lies about my character. Instead, it was a conference hall filled with 300 family therapists, social workers, and advocates who had come to hear Sofia and me speak about resilience, truth, and the unexpected ways children can become champions of justice in their own families. Sofia, now 14, sat beside me on the stage, poised and confident in a way that still took my breath away. She wore a navy blue dress with small white flowers, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she held her notes with the same steady hands that had once held her phone as evidence of her father's manipulation. The moderator, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a renowned child psychologist, smiled warmly at both of us. Sarah and Sofia, your story has inspired thousands of families across the country. Can you tell us how this journey began for you? I looked out at the audience, seeing faces that reflected hope, curiosity, and recognition. These were people who worked with broken families every day, who understood the complexities of healing from emotional abuse, who knew how rare it was for a story like ours to have such a positive outcome. It began with a choice, I said, my voice steady and strong. The choice to believe my children when they showed me through their actions that something was wrong. But more importantly, it began when Sofia made the choice to document the truth, even when doing so was frightening and difficult. Sofia leaned forward toward her microphone, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same conviction it had. That night 2 years ago, but with an added layer of wisdom that came from having processed and grown from her experiences. I think it actually began earlier than that, she said thoughtfully. It began when I realized that protecting my little brother and my mom was more important than keeping my dad's secrets. When you're a kid in a situation like ours, you learn pretty quickly that adults don't always tell the truth. And sometimes you have to become your own advocate. Dr. Martinez nodded encouragingly. Sofia, you were only 12 when you stood up in front of that room full of adults. What gave you the courage to speak out? Sofia was quiet for a moment, considering, her answer with the care of someone who understood that her words might influence other children facing similar situations. I think courage isn't really about not being scared, she said finally. It's about being scared but doing the right thing anyway because someone has to. My brother Diego was having nightmares. My mom was crying when she thought we couldn't. See? And my dad was trying to convince everyone that the person who loved us most was actually hurting us. Someone had to tell the truth. She paused, looking out at the audience with eyes that had seen too much too young, but had somehow emerged, clear and bright. But I also want to say something to any kids who might be listening to this story. You shouldn't have to be the one to fix your family's problems. What I did worked for us, but every situation is different. The most important thing is to find a safe adult you can trust and tell them what's happening. It doesn't have to be your job to save everyone. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, and I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with public recognition and everything to do with watching my daughter use her experiences to help others. Dr. Martinez turned to me. Sarah, as a mother, how did you process watching your 12-year-old daughter handle such an adult situation? It was a question I'd been asked many times over the past 2 years, and each time I answered it, I discovered new layers of meaning in our experience. It was simultaneously the most proud and most heartbroken I've ever been, I said honestly. Proud because Sofia showed incredible strength and moral clarity. Heartbroken because she shouldn't have needed to. No child should have to stand up to an adult who's supposed to protect them. But watching her do it taught me something profound about the resilience of children and the power of truth. I looked at Sofia, who was listening intently, as if hearing our story from a new perspective. Sophia didn't just save our family that night. She taught an entire room full of adults about integrity, courage, and the importance of believing children when they tell us something is wrong. She showed them that kids aren't just passive recipients of adult decisions, but active participants in their own lives who deserve to have their voices heard and respected. An audience member raised her hand, and Dr. Martinez called on her. She was a young woman, probably in her early 30s, with the slightly tired look of someone who worked in social services. "I'm a caseworker with Child Protective Services," she said, "and I see situations like yours all the time. The difference is that most children don't have the resources or support to document what's happening to them. What advice would you give to professionals who work with families where one parent is engaging in parental alienation?" Sophia and I exchanged glances, and she nodded for me to take the lead on this one. "Listen to the children," I said immediately. "Not just their words, but their behavior, their emotions, their patterns. Children who are being manipulated often show signs of stress that have nothing to do with normal adjustment to divorce. They're anxious, they're walking on eggshells, they're carrying adult emotional burdens." I thought about those terrible months when Sophia had been documenting Marcus's messages, how she'd been quieter than usual, more serious, how she'd started asking strange questions about whether adults always told the truth. "But also," I continued, "give children tools to advocate for themselves when it's safe to do so." Sophia's phone became her lifeline because she had access to technology and the knowledge that documentation could be powerful. Not every child has those resources, but every child can be taught that their feelings and observations matter. Sophia raised her hand slightly, asking for permission to add something, and Dr. Martinez nodded. "I want to talk about something that I think gets missed a lot in these conversations," Sophia said, her voice taking on the passionate tone she used when discussing something she cared deeply about. "Everyone always focuses on the bad parent, the one doing the manipulation, but they don't talk enough about how to recognize and celebrate the good parent." She turned to look at me, and I felt tears prick my eyes at the love and respect I saw in her face. "My mom never once said anything bad about my dad to us, even when she would have been completely justified in doing so. She never tried to turn us against him or make us choose sides. When we came home upset after visits with him, she listened and comforted us without ever saying, 'I told you so,' or trying to use our pain to make herself look better." Sophia's voice grew stronger as she continued, and I realized she was sharing insights that had come from 2 years of therapy, reflection, and processing her experiences. That's how I knew who was telling the truth. It wasn't just about the mean messages my dad sent. It was about how my mom handled the whole situation. She protected us without turning us into weapons. She told us age-appropriate truths without overwhelming us with adult problems. She showed us what healthy love looked like by loving us consistently, even when we were confused or acting out because of what was happening. The room was completely silent, hanging on every word from this remarkable teenager who was articulating complex psychological concepts with the clarity that comes from lived experience. "So if you're a professional working with families like ours," Sophia concluded, "don't just look for the signs of manipulation. Look for the signs of healthy parenting. Too, they're just as important." Dr. Martinez leaned back in her chair, clearly moved by Sophia's words. "That's incredibly insightful, Sophia. Can you tell us how your relationship with your father has evolved since that night at the community center?" Sophia was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. This was always the hardest part of our story to discuss, the part that didn't have a neat, happy ending. "My dad and I don't have a relationship right now," she said finally. "He stopped trying to see us after what happened that night, and honestly, that's been a relief. The relationship we had before wasn't healthy anyway. It was based on him trying to control how we felt about our mom and ourselves. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was sad but resolute. I hope someday he'll get help and learn how to be a better person. I hope someday he'll understand that what he did was wrong and find a way to apologize sincerely. But I'm not waiting for that to happen before I live my life and pursue my own happiness. Sofia looked directly into the audience, addressing families who might be struggling with similar situations. If you're a kid dealing with a parent who's trying to manipulate you, you need to know that it's okay to protect yourself, even if that means limiting contact with that parent. You don't owe anyone a relationship that hurts you, even if that person is related to you, and you're not responsible for fixing them or waiting around hoping they'll change. The wisdom in her words was staggering. This was a 14-year-old who had learned lessons about boundaries and self-protection that many adults never master. An older man in the back of the room raised his hand. I'm a family court judge, he said, and I see cases involving parental alienation regularly. How can the legal system better protect children in these situations? I felt Sofia tense beside me. The legal system had been something we'd managed to avoid, but we both knew that many families weren't so fortunate. Believe the children, I said immediately. In our case, Sofia's evidence was so clear that we never had to go to court, but I know many children who have tried to tell judges and lawyers what was happening to them and weren't believed because the manipulative parent was more convincing. Sofia nodded vigorously. And don't make kids choose sides, she added. The whole reason my dad's manipulation worked for so long was because he made everything about choosing between him and my mom. When adults in the legal system do the same thing, it just makes everything worse. She thought for a moment, then added, maybe there should be ways for kids to present evidence privately without having to confront the parent who's hurting them. I was lucky that I felt safe enough to speak up that night, but a lot of kids don't feel safe. Dr. Martinez checked her notes and smiled. I want to ask you both about something positive. How has this experience changed your family for the better? Sofia and I looked at each other and smiled simultaneously. This was the part of our story that we both loved talking about. It taught us that we can handle anything together, I said. Sofia and Diego and I went through something terrible, but we came out stronger on the other side. We learned to communicate better, to trust each other completely, and to face problems head-on instead of hoping they'll go away. Sofia nodded enthusiastically. And it taught me that I'm braver than I thought I was. Before all this happened, I was just a regular kid who didn't like conflict and wanted everyone to be happy. But when I had to choose between keeping peace and protecting my family, I found out that I could be strong when it mattered. She paused, then added with a grin, plus, my mom and I have become like a team. We talk about everything now. She treats me like someone whose opinions matter, and I know I can tell her anything without being judged. I reached over and squeezed Sofia's hand. She's taught me as much as I've taught her, maybe more. Dr. Martinez glanced at her watch and then addressed the audience. We have time for one more question. A woman in the middle of the room stood up. This question is for Sofia. What would you say to other kids who are in situations similar to what you experienced? Sofia straightened in her chair, and I could see her mentally preparing to deliver what she considered the most important message of the entire presentation. First, I tell them that what's happening to them isn't their fault. When a parent tries to turn you against your other parent, or when they say mean things about someone you love, that's their problem, not yours. You didn't cause it, and you can't fix it. Her voice grew more passionate as she continued. Second, I'd tell them to find ways to document what's happening if it's safe to do so. Screenshots, recordings, keeping a journal. Not because they have to fix everything themselves, but because having evidence can help the adults who are trying to help them. Sofia looked directly at several young people scattered throughout the audience, speaking directly to them now. Third, find at least one adult you can trust completely and tell them everything. It might be a teacher, a counselor, a family member, or a friend's parent. Don't try to handle everything alone. She paused, then delivered her final point with the conviction of someone who had lived through the storm and emerged into sunlight. And finally, remember that you deserve to be loved without conditions, without manipulation, without having to choose sides. If someone is making you feel guilty for loving another person, or if they're trying to convince you that someone who treats you well is actually bad for you, trust your own feelings. You know what love feels like, and you know what fear feels like. Choose the people who make you feel safe and valued, even if other people try to tell you you're wrong. The standing ovation that followed lasted for nearly 5 minutes. As we walked off the stage together, Sofia slipped her hand into mine. "Mom," she said quietly, "do you think we're actually helping people with these talks?" I stopped walking and turned to face her. This incredible young woman who had saved our family and was now using her experience to help others. "Sofia," I said, "every time you tell our story, you give other children permission to believe in their own strength. Every time you show adults what courage looks like, you make it more likely that the next child in a situation like ours will be believed and protected. Yes, we're helping people. We're changing lives." Sofia smiled, the same bright, determined smile she'd worn that night at the community center when she'd stood up to her father and changed everything. "Good," she said simply, "because there are a lot more kids out there who need to know they're not alone." As we walked out of the conference center together, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. We'd started as victims of manipulation and emotional abuse. We'd become survivors through courage and truth-telling, and now we were thrivers, using our experiences to light the way for other families struggling in the darkness. Sofia had taught me that heroes don't always wear capes or possess superhuman strength. Sometimes they're just ordinary people who decide that protecting the ones they love is more important than keeping the peace. Sometimes they're children who refuse to let lies stand unchallenged, even when challenging them is scary. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth and trust that the people who matter will listen. 5 years had passed since that pivotal night at the community center, and I was standing in the kitchen of our new home, watching through the window as Sofia, now 17, helped her younger brother Diego load camping gear into our SUV. Tomorrow marked the beginning of something I never could have imagined during those dark days of our divorce, the first annual Truth Tellers summer camp for children and teenagers who had experienced parental alienation. The idea had been Sofia's, born from dozens of speaking engagements and hundreds of letters from families across the country who had reached out after hearing our story. She'd spent her junior year developing the concept as her capstone project, working with child psychologists, legal advocates, and other survivor families to create a week-long program that would give kids the tools they needed to navigate complex family situations while building their confidence and resilience. Diego, now 15 and nearly as tall as his sister, had become the camp's unofficial technology coordinator. His gentle nature and intuitive understanding of trauma had made him a natural mentor for younger children, and his skill with recording equipment and digital documentation had proven invaluable in teaching kids how to safely preserve evidence when necessary. "Mom," Sofia called from the driveway, "did you remember to pack the portable speakers for tonight's opening ceremony?" I smiled, checking my mental list for the 100th time that morning. Tonight, 43 children between the ages of 8 and 17 would gather around a campfire to share their stories, their fears, and their hopes for the week ahead. Some would be attending with the full support of their protective parent. Others would be there despite active legal battles still raging in family courts. All of them would leave knowing they weren't alone. "They're in the blue duffel bag," I called back, along with the backup microphones and extra batteries. The camp itself was located on 50 acres of pine forest, about 2 hours north of Phoenix, donated by Margaret Chen, Tom's sister, who had built a successful retreat center. After her own experience with domestic violence 20 years earlier, Margaret had been in the audience during one of our first speaking engagements, and afterward she'd approached us with tears in her eyes and an offer we couldn't refuse. "I've been waiting 30 years for someone to create something like this," she told Sofia. "My property, my facilities, my support staff, it's all yours for as long as you need it." What started as a one-week pilot program had grown into something none of us had anticipated. We now had a waiting list of over 200 families, partnerships with 3 universities studying the long-term effects of parental alienation, and a network of volunteer counselors who were themselves survivors of family manipulation and abuse. But the real magic happened in the connections between the kids themselves. Children who had spent years feeling isolated and confused discovered that their experiences weren't unique, that the gaslighting and manipulation they'd endured followed predictable patterns, and most importantly, that recovery was not only possible, but probable with the right support. As I finished loading the last of our supplies, my phone buzzed with a text from Elena, my sister in Iowa. She'd become one of the camp's most dedicated volunteer coordinators, using her background in education to develop age-appropriate curricula for different groups. "Just picked up the last 3 campers from the airport," her message read. 2 siblings from Oregon, whose custody case just concluded in their favor, and a 14-year-old from Florida whose story will break your heart and inspire your soul. ETA 90 minutes. I showed the text to Sofia, who was double-checking her own detailed lists with the methodical precision that had made her such an effective advocate for other families. "That means we'll have representation from 22 states this year," she said with satisfaction. "Remember when we thought reaching families outside of Arizona would be impossible?" The growth of our impact still amazed me. What had started as a local story of one family's triumph over manipulation had somehow resonated with people across the country and even internationally. We'd received messages from families in Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and dozens of other countries where children were struggling with similar situations. Diego jogged over from where he'd been testing the camp's new video equipment. At 15, he'd grown into his sensitivity, channeling his natural empathy into a remarkable ability to help other children feel safe enough to share their experiences. "Mom, I've been thinking about something," he said, his expression serious in the way that always preceded his most insightful observations. "What if we started a sister program for the siblings who don't get to come to camp? Like the kids who are still stuck with the alienating parent or who are too young to participate?" Sofia's eyes lit up with immediate interest. "That's brilliant, Diego. We could create care packages, maybe video messages from campers who've been through similar situations. Show them that someone is thinking about them and working towards solutions." This was how it always happened with my children. One idea would spark another, and before I knew it, they'd developed an entire initiative that would help dozens or hundreds of additional families. Their creativity and compassion never ceased to amaze me. "Let's add that to our evening planning session," I suggested. "But right now, we need to get to camp before the first families arrive." The drive to Camp Truth Tellers, as the kids had dubbed it, was filled with the kind of comfortable conversation that had become our family's trademark. We'd learned to talk about everything openly and honestly, treating difficult topics with age-appropriate directness rather than evasion or sugarcoating. "Are you nervous about anything this year?" I asked Sofia as we wound through mountain roads lined with towering pines. She considered the question carefully, something she'd learned to do during our family therapy sessions in the years following the community center incident. "Not nervous exactly," she said finally, "but I feel the weight of responsibility. These kids are coming to us because they believe we can help them find their way through situations that feel impossible. That's a big trust to honor." Diego nodded from the back seat. "I think about that too. Like, what if we can't help someone? What if their situation is too complicated or dangerous for what we're offering?" It was a valid concern, and one we'd addressed extensively with our team of volunteer counselors and child psychologists. We'd learned early on that some situations required more intensive intervention than a week-long camp could provide, and we'd developed partnerships with legal advocates and therapeutic programs to ensure that every child left with appropriate resources for their specific circumstances. "Remember what Dr. Williams always tells us," I said, referring to the clinical psychologist who served as our program's director. "Our job isn't to fix everything for these kids. Our job is to show them they have power over their own stories and give them tools to use that power safely and effectively." As we pulled into the camp's main parking area, I felt the familiar mixture of excitement and reverence that always accompanied the beginning of a new session. In a few hours, this peaceful mountain setting would be filled with children who had survived experiences that would challenge most adults. But they wouldn't just be survivors here. They would be teachers, leaders, advocates, and friends. The camp's main lodge was already bustling with activity as our volunteer staff prepared for the arrival of families. Jennifer Morrison, whose daughter had been in Sofia's class during the worst of our custody battle, was now our head of family services. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job as a social worker to help coordinate the complex logistics of bringing together families from across the country. "Sarah," she called out as we entered the lodge. "Perfect timing. We just received confirmation that the documentary crew from PBS will be here Thursday to film the conflict resolution workshop. And the publisher from New York wants to schedule a call about Sofia's book proposal." Sofia's book proposal. Even thinking about it filled me with pride and amazement. At 17, my daughter was in negotiations to publish a memoir and guide for teenagers dealing with parental alienation. The proposal had generated interest from multiple publishers, not just because of Sofia's compelling personal story, but because of her unique ability to translate complex psychological concepts into language that young people could understand and apply. "Can we schedule that call for Friday afternoon?" Sofia asked, pulling out her phone to check her calendar. "I want to be fully present for the campers while they're here." This was so typical of Sofia. Even as opportunities for her own advancement and recognition multiplied, she never lost sight of the mission that had started it all, helping other children find their voices and their strength. As families began arriving throughout the afternoon, I watched Sofia and Diego transform into the natural leaders they'd become. They greeted each child individually, remembering details from applications and intake interviews, making connections between campers who might have similar experiences or interests. 8-year-old Emma from Colorado was attending with her grandmother, her protective parent having gained custody just 6 months earlier after a brutal legal battle. Sofia knelt down to Emma's eye level, speaking in gentle tones about the horses they'd be visiting later in the week, and the art therapy sessions, where Emma could express her feelings through painting and sculpture. 16-year-old Marcus from Texas had driven to camp with his father, his first time leaving his home state since his mother's successful alienation campaign had been exposed in family court. Diego immediately connected with Marcus over there, shared love of video editing, explaining how they'd be working together to create a camp documentary that would preserve everyone's stories while protecting their privacy. 12-year-old twins, Sarah and Samuel from Michigan, had endured 3 years of their father telling them that their mother was mentally ill and dangerous, despite clear evidence to the contrary. Sofia introduced them to other sibling pairs who had supported each other through similar ordeals, beginning the process of showing them that their bond as siblings was a strength, not a weakness. As the sun began to set over the mountains, we gathered around the large fire pit in the center of camp for our opening ceremony. The 43 campers sat in concentric circles, some confident and outgoing, others shy and uncertain, all of them carrying stories that had shaped them in profound ways. Sofia stood up to address the group, her voice carrying easily across the circle in the still mountain air. "Welcome to Truth Tellers Camp," she began, and I could hear the emotion in her voice despite her composed demeanor. Every person sitting around this fire tonight has survived something that most people can't even imagine. You've been told lies about people you love. You've been asked to choose sides in battles you didn't start. You've been made to feel responsible for adult problems that were never yours to solve. She paused, looking around the circle at faces that ranged from 8 to 17, each one reflecting a different stage of healing and understanding. But here's what I want you to know from the very beginning. You are not victims. You are not broken. You are not damaged goods. You are warriors who have been fighting for truth and love in situations where both were under attack. And this week, you're going to learn just how powerful you really are. The applause that followed was tentative at first, then growing stronger, as the children began to believe that they were in a place where their experiences would be honored rather than minimized. Diego stood up next, his naturally gentle demeanor putting the younger campers at ease immediately. "My sister and I know what it's like to feel like you're the only kids in the world dealing with this stuff," he said. "We know what it's like to lie awake at night wondering if you're crazy for seeing things differently than one of your parents wants you to see them. We know what it's like to love someone who's trying to teach you to hate someone else." His words were simple, but they cut straight to the heart of the shared experience that had brought all these children together. This week, you're going to meet other kids who understand exactly what you've been through. You're going to learn skills that will help you navigate complicated family situations, and most importantly, you're going to discover that you're part of a community of people who believe in truth, love, and the power of children to change their own stories. As the formal opening ceremony concluded and families began heading to their cabins for the night, I found myself standing alone by the dying fire, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had grown from that terrible, wonderful night at the community center 5 years earlier. Margaret Chen appeared beside me, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate from the lodge kitchen. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling into one of the Adirondack chairs that surrounded the fire pit. "I was just thinking about how impossible all of this would have seemed 5 years ago," I said, accepting the warm mug gratefully. "When Sofia stood up in that community center, I thought we were just trying to survive the moment. I never imagined it would lead to something like this." Margaret smiled, her eyes reflecting the last glimmers of firelight. "That's the thing about truth, Sarah. When you speak it courageously, it has a way of growing and multiplying and touching lives you never expected to reach." She was right, of course. The ripple effects of Sofia's courage that night had extended far beyond our own family's healing. We'd heard from parents who had found the strength to leave abusive relationships after hearing our story. We'd connected with lawyers who had changed their approach to custody cases involving alienation. We'd influenced policy discussions about how family courts could better protect children from manipulation. But sitting there in the mountain stillness, surrounded by cabins full of children who had traveled across the country to find community and healing, I realized that the most important impact might be the simplest one: showing other families that recovery was possible, that children could emerge from these experiences stronger rather than broken, and that truth really could triumph over lies when it was spoken with enough courage and persistence. "Margaret," I said, "do you think we're doing enough? There are so many families still struggling, so many children who don't have access to resources like this camp." Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering my question with the thoughtfulness that had made her such a valuable partner in this work. Sarah, 5 years ago, there was essentially no support for children experiencing parental alienation. No camps, no specialized therapy programs, no books written specifically for kids going through these situations. "Look around you." She gestured toward the cabins, where 43 children were sleeping peacefully, many of them for the first time in months or years. "You've created something from nothing. You've given voice to experiences that were previously invisible. You've shown the world that children can be heroes in their own stories." She paused, then added with a smile, "But more than that, you've raised 2 children who are going to spend their lives making sure other kids never have to suffer in silence the way they did. The work you're doing today is important, but the work Sofia and Diego will do for the next 50 years, that's going to change everything." As I walked back toward our cabin, passing the quiet buildings where families from across the country were resting before beginning a week of healing and growth, I thought about Margaret's words. Sofia and Diego had indeed been transformed by their experiences, but not in the ways Marcus had intended when he tried to poison them against me. Instead of becoming bitter or broken, they'd become compassionate leaders who understood the power of truth and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Tomorrow would bring workshops on documentation and evidence preservation, sessions on healthy communication and boundary setting, activities designed to rebuild trust and self-confidence. The children would learn practical skills, but more importantly, they would discover that they weren't alone, that their experiences made sense, and that their futures were full of possibility. As I settled into bed in our cabin, I could hear Sofia and Diego in the next room, quietly reviewing the next day's schedule and discussing ways to improve the programming based on feedback from previous sessions. They were still so young, but they'd already dedicated their lives to ensuring that other children would have the support and resources that we'd had to create for ourselves. The last thing I heard before falling asleep was Sofia's voice, speaking quietly to her brother about a new initiative they wanted to propose. A scholarship program that would bring international families to camp, expanding their community of truth-tellers to include children from around the world who were struggling with similar situations. Even in sleep, my children were dreaming of ways to help others heal and grow stronger. Marcus had tried to use them as weapons against me, but instead, he'd inadvertently raised them to become warriors for justice, advocates for truth, and healers for other broken families. Sometimes the most terrible experiences in our lives become the foundation for our greatest contributions to the world. Sofia and Diego had learned that lesson early, and they were already using it to light the way for others walking through their own darkness toward healing and hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.